Hello, hope you had a good week. Join me to paint this beautiful little facade scene. It is a very simple scene with just doors and windows. I particularly like it because of the bright and contrasting colors and the textures and shadows. So I first start by wetting my paper on both sides. As you can see, it just helps me to stretch my paper beforehand, and I wipe out extra water from the paper as well before I start to sketch. For sketching, I'm using an aquarelle graphite pencil. It works really well on damp and wet surfaces, and I particularly like how dark it tends to be and how much of texture it gives me. So let's start by sketching some simple shapes for doors and windows. I try to keep it rather simple at this stage. I do not need any sort of details now, although it is very easy to just get engrossed into the details. It is very important to just stick to the simple shapes. I quite like the wooden beam above the doorway and that circular wooden beam sticking out. So that, I'm guessing, is the end of a circular wooden beam that goes through the building. I really like these simple details. Just going to record that at the moment in simple shapes. Again, trying my best not to add too much details at this stage. I always have a tendency to go back and add details, but however, it is a learning curve and I'm trying to reduce the details that I add at this stage. Saying that, I particularly love the details on this window, those little bricks and that little planter over there. So let's draw that in a simple shape again. The hanging lanterns are another detail that I particularly love in this reference picture. I'm only trying to get the basic shape or the outline of those lanterns. I'm not adding a lot of details, just some simple shapes to depict the lanterns right now, and we can always paint that in watercolors. And finally, I'm going to add that large pink planter on the left side. So just drawing that out. I quite like the shadows on it, so I'm going to leave that until I start watercolors, but for now it's just the outline of the planter. Just a little bit more details for texture of the wall. I'm going to include a few bricks or stone-like structures on the wall. I will soon begin to paint this scene, and I'm going to use a flat brush to begin with. It's always good to use a larger flat brush to just block out the main big shapes and colors. And now I'm going to start off with some watercolors, and starting off with some ultramarine blue for the shadows of that white curtain that's inside the doors and the windows. I'm just going to be very careful to leave a little bit of white unpainted areas for light reflections. And I think I prefer using ultramarine blue at this stage, especially because I can see how warm this scene is. There's a huge amount of sunlight falling on this facade, and I just love to use ultramarine blue when it comes to a warm scene. I just feel that ultramarine blue is a warm color. And for the wooden beam, I'm starting off with some burnt sienna. So it's just fresh burnt sienna, and I'm going to place it directly onto the watercolor paper, just making sure to leave out a few areas, especially the top of the lantern and that little plaque with the number on. It's a different color, so I'm going to paint around it. Now I'm going to mix that with a bit of ultramarine blue, and you can see how that brown or burnt sienna is gone a little bit deeper, so we get kind of dark brown, which gives the texture and shadows on this wooden beam. And sometimes it's a good idea to add some fresh ultramarine blue into this wet brown, and I just love the way the two colors mix together. So it's all about just dropping in some color, letting watercolor do its job on paper. Very little of painting going on here. It's more about just dropping in the colors. And now I'm going to block out some color for the wall. I'm using Naples yellow here. So it's a good idea to start painting just the bigger shapes and bigger colors, and once you have all the colors down, and then we can always go into details. It's very easy for us to just concentrate on one area with a lot of details, and I'm trying my best not to do that, just reminding myself at each and every stage to just get the basic colors down, but simple shapes. For the planter, I'm using permanent rose. I just love the bright color that it gives, and you can see I'm only painting on one side where the shadows are. The other side I've used some water to water it down, just make it more diluted. Now let's start adding some color on the door. I'm starting off with the shadow on the side of the door first. So this is a mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. You can vary the amount of ultramarine blue to bring a more grey-like color. And for the ground, again, I'm starting off with burnt sienna, adding a lot of ultramarine blue to get that deep brown. Again, working wet in wet, which means the surface is quite wet. I'm just going to drop in some green. The green that I'm using here is olive green, and also a little bit of color just to depict foliage on the ground. And I love to let all the colors bleed into each other and creating a very soft outcome. The planter on the window is a mixture of lemon yellow and a tiny bit of olive green, just to get me like a greenish yellowish color. And I'm just going to add in again a little bit of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue inside that trough, just to show some mud or something that's inside the trough. The lanterns are quite tricky in itself, but it's a good way to tackle it just by thinking of it as simple shapes. Don't think of it as lanterns, just paint what you see there, and that's all I've done here. I'm not quite happy with it, but at the same time I like the fact that I haven't overworked, which is normally the case. So for the larger lantern by the door, I'm also going to use a little bit of cadmium orange with a bit of red, a mixture of both, and I'm just going to place the colours there. Think of it as larger shapes. And with the foliage in the pink planter, I'm just going to start with some spatter. I really love using spatters. It just gives me more freedom to work, and I just love that looseness as well. And simultaneously I can add a little bit of lines for the leaves and the foliage that's within the planter. You can see that I'm using a smaller brush here for details, and you can add some shadow colors now, especially on the pink planter. All I'm using is an ultramarine blue mixture with a little bit of burnt sienna, which would have been in my brush already, but otherwise ultramarine blue is a great contrast for the rose or pink color planter that I have here. I've also mixed a little bit of ultramarine blue with the rose I was using, so you can see it's created a very nice shadow on that planter. Now let's start working on the door. The blue that I'm using here is phthalo blue. I have muted it down with a little bit of warm red, so any warm red is fine. Here I've used cadmium red. You can even use permanent red for this matter. And the minute you add a little bit of red, that bright color of the blue is muted down, and which is the exact color that I was looking for. Again, I'm going around the shapes, which are like the window shapes on the door, and just basically placing that color into that shape. I am deliberately letting it bleed into the other colors around as well, and it's okay to have a little bit of color bleeds. So let's add another layer, or let's add a little bit more pigment of blue into that door in certain areas where I want it to be a bit more darker. I'm going to use the same color for the window frame as well. So now I'm going to start dropping in some blue into that wet area of the door, mainly on the side where I can see shadows in the reference picture, and also just to enhance the design of the door, especially those lines. I'm just going to go over it. You can see that the door cut was still quite wet, so which means the blue that I have added has blended in and bled into the surrounding areas as well, which is completely fine. And now I'm going to let the whole thing dry for a little bit so I can add those finer details and lines just to bring this whole thing together. Now I'm going to start off with the door again, just adding some finer details, those darker shadows. I'm using the same color, phthalo blue, with a little bit of red, and I'm just going over the details, the edges, just to make it a little bit more neat, because the surface of the paper is now dry. Even if I work around it, it's not going to bleed like how it did initially. So now I can put in some more details. I'm now going to work on that wooden beam above the door and the window. So I'm using a mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna to get a very dark brown, and just adding in those texture and those grooves of the wooden beam. And at the same time, I'd like to retain those color bleeds and that softness that I did initially. I'm just going to add some dry brush technique as well to add in some texture. I'm going to work on the shadows where the planter is on the window, mainly the corners of that window where the planter is sitting. I'm going to add a deeper color, the same phthalo blue with a little bit of red, but this time obviously it's sitting on top of the first layer and I have more pigment compared to water. So that just makes it a little bit more darker, but in reality it's the same color. And you can see how the lantern on the left side of the window is standing out a little bit more. That's because I've added that contrasting dark color in the background. And for the shadows on the wall, I'm using a mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Those two colors have gone into several areas of this painting, and it is a great color, a great mixture to use for shadows as well as for wood color, depending on how much of blue you have in the mixture. I'm using the same brush, the same mixture on my brush to add a little bit of shadows and details for the foliage in that planter, and some shadows on the planter itself. And again, you can add a little bit of texture on the wall as well, which is completely optional. And finally, I'm going to place some shadows around the lanterns and the side of the door as well. And I'm going to define a few edges, the bottom of the door, the ground in front of us. And for all these final details or the final lines that I'm adding, I'm using the same mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. For the wooden beam areas, I probably would have added a little bit more burnt sienna in it. For the more cooler areas where I'd like a bit more blue color, I would add a bit more ultramarine blue into the mixture.